if my organization looks like theirs, how do I know I've got the right defenses in place so I'm not the next one, right? I think a lot of people were kind of realizing that, if you're the first, you could potentially kind of claim, well, hey, I didn't see this coming, right? I was the first. But after, a dozen, 2 dozen, hundreds or thousands, now it's well, everybody kind of knows what this looks like. You can't claim ignorance anymore. So people wanted to learn more and more about it.
This is a Security Weekly production. Security Weekly is a resource of Cyber Risk Alliance.
The Cybersecurity Collaborative and Wiz is proud to present CISO Stories. Each week, CISO Stories takes a deep dive on security leadership with one of the contributors to my latest book, the best-selling CISO Compass: Navigating Cybersecurity Leadership Challenges with Insights from Pioneers, as well as from other top CISOs and security thought leaders. The Cybersecurity Collaborative is a unique membership community enabling cybersecurity leaders to work together in a trusted environment. To learn more, visit securityweekly.com/CSC or visit cyberleadersunite.com. I am your host, Todd Fitzgerald, and this week we welcome Chris Novak, Managing Director at Verizon and contributing author to the Data Breach Investigations Report, and recently appointed to the President's inaugural Cyber Safety Review Board.
Honestly, I'd say my journey to cybersecurity is, I think, maybe a little bit unusual in the sense that it wasn't a straight line like maybe some people's are today. And what I mean by that is I think there's a lot of people today who get into cybersecurity knowing it's what they want to do. Interestingly enough, when I got into cybersecurity, there wasn't even the word cybersecurity, or if it was really more for TV and movies. It wasn't like a real career field. You couldn't get a degree in it. So honestly, my career actually started in electrical engineering and computer engineering just because it was something I was always fascinated in. And then, I started getting into industrial control systems and operational technology. Y2K came around, which created an explosion of interest in OT and ICS. And then kind of as that waned, I said, this IT world is getting really interesting, kind of early 2000s or late 90s, early 2000s. That was really kind of taking off. And so I kind of shifted in that direction. And then before long, you have the e-commerce booms. And that really brought me into security. And I found that to be just absolutely fascinating. So I kind of, I don't know if I want to say I kind of went down a path that at the time I really couldn't see much further in front of me to know what the industry was going to look like. But it just was, every day was more exciting. And, that was the part that really, I'd say, once I kind of dipped a toe in, the part that really got me excited after that was that it was just always changing and it was fast paced, and from my perspective, it was a field that I just couldn't get bored in. I was looking for something that challenged me and pushed me. And, that's what I found. And still to this day, honestly, there were times where I'm like, I don't even know how much time I want to take off and go on vacation because I'm afraid I'm going to miss something,
Well, that means that you're in the right place.
Yeah. So, and it's a, in my role, I've done a lot of incident response and digital forensics throughout the years. And now I manage a really large team that does it. And, for me, I always kind of felt like there was always this constant adrenaline rush of, you're kind of trying to outdo the hacker and trying to undo what they've done, all while they might still be trying to get back in. So, that was always just exhilarating and exciting.
I mentioned on this podcast before that my father was an electrical engineer. And so I grew up in a house and you go down to the basement, and there's oscilloscopes and TVs and radios and he was always like inventing something. It was the engineer in him. And it was great when I was a kid because I had a model train track.
So did I. Maybe there's something to that.
and the problem, and you probably know this problem, I had the N gauge and
tiny
little solenoid switches would always stick.
Yep.
And so he's I'm an engineer, so I have to solve this problem. And so I had this little box, and it had a red or a green light, and it had little relays in it. And so I just have to press a button, and it would flip the track one way or the other. So.
Yeah. Totally agree with you there. And I honestly, until you said that, I hadn't really thought about how much as a kid I spent time kind of tinkering with things. My father was big into electronics. And so there was always something in the house you could, take apart, break it, and then try to figure out how it worked and hopefully get all the parts back together and make it work again. And I found the problem solving elements of it, just interesting and intriguing.
So you have been with Verizon for quite some time now, and have produced this report, the data breach incident response report. Is that what the DBIR?
Data breach investigations report, DBIR.
Investigations report, and it's become like a staple in the industry. We usually don't, talk about specific products and stuff, but the DBIR has so much information that I think so many CISOs use. I thought, it'd be great to talk about the DBIR report and how did that get started?
So to be honest, it started at the time when we first created. The first one was actually in 2008. And it's hard to believe now when you look at the incident landscape and you feel like everywhere you go, you see and hear stuff about it. And there's, like I said, there's now classes. You can get a degree, a master's, probably even a PhD. But back in 2008, the problem we faced was we would be doing hundreds of breach investigations every year. And there'd inevitably be an event that made it into the news, and then everyone would be wanting to figure out, what happened to that victim? And then how do I make sure it doesn't happen to me? And we would get just, our phones would light up after any big breach hit the news, because there was a good chance at the time that, hey, if it was big, we were probably involved. And so everybody wanted commentary. Everybody wanted to know what was going on. CISOs or CIOs or whomever it was at the time that was managing security wanted to know, hey, how can I make sure if my organization looks like theirs, how do I know I've got the right defenses in place so I'm not the next one, right? I think a lot of people were kind of realizing that, if you're the first, you could potentially kind of claim, well, hey, I didn't see this coming, right? I was the first. But after, a dozen, 2 dozen, hundreds or thousands, now it's everybody kind of knows what this looks like. You can't claim ignorance anymore. So people wanted to learn more and more about it. And so at that point, our team said, look, we never commented on specific incidents and breaches. That was always our policy. Still to this day, we don't comment on specific events, but we said, look, we have enough data now. We can aggregate that all together and actually put out something that essentially, answers the questions. When I talk about cyber, I draw a lot of analogies between cyber and healthcare. And kind of the way I look at the DBIR is kind of almost in a similar fashion and say, look, I don't need to know the identity of a patient that might have a similar characteristic as me in order to learn what I should do to make myself healthier. But if I know from the research papers or from my doctor that, hey, people in my age bracket, my demographics, my lifestyle typically benefit from these activities, or, want to have a diet like this or an exercise regimen like that, I can get all the benefits and avoid the risks without actually having to know the identities of the other patients in the study, for example. And so that was really what brought us to the idea of coming up with the DBIRs. People don't really need to know who the victims are. As long as you know what it is that we learned from those events, you can still apply them. And then over time, what we really tried to do was say, look, well, we have lots of data and we do lots of incident investigations and responses. Let's get data from more organizations so we can really round out the data set, get other perspectives from other incident response firms. And so that's really how it came to be as big as it is today. The first one I mentioned in 2008 was only about maybe 30 pages. Mm-hmm. Now we're over 100 pages long, and there's 87 organizations that contribute, evidence and data to the report's analytics.
Mm-hmm. And I think it is very, very useful in that way. And I know a lot of people, in the boardrooms will reference, some of those findings. So let's flip to, where we're at today. What are some of those big threats that we're seeing today?
Yeah, so I'd say, without a doubt, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention ransomware and what we're seeing there. I mean, honestly, just looking back on the data that we have on that, we've seen a continuous increase in the quantity and types of ransomware events. In fact, just in the last year, the increase we saw in ransomware events was more than the previous 5 years combined. So, it's not something that we see as going away. And in fact, if you can believe it, you can go back in time at a point in the DBIR where we actually, several years ago, probably 10 plus years ago now, we actually were just first kind of seeing ransomware events and saying, these are interesting, but they weren't very common and nobody really knew what to do with them. But we had a little asterisk in the report and it said, look, watch out. If people start paying the ransoms, this could really take off. And now here we are looking at the DBIR. It's the number one most common form of malware that we see impacting organizations. Mm-hmm. And I think part of the contributing elements to that are we're also seeing more organizations pay. You look at the landscape of cyber insurance and the fact that a lot more organizations, I don't know if I want to say they kind of have like an easy button. If they get hit, they call their insurance company and their insurance company can facilitate the ransom payment. Maybe not in every case, but we see a trend in that direction that is also facilitating more of the attacks because the actors believe, hey, I'll get paid. The other thing that's interesting about it too, when we actually put together this year's DBIR, we were kind of dumbfounded by one of the numbers that came out of it, and that was the chart that talks about the time frame to discover that a victim has been breached. And historically, it's about 8 months or so is what we would find was the average discovery time frame. Mm-hmm. And as we started crunching more and more ransomware attacks, as you might imagine, that number started speeding up. But the thing that I had to keep impressing upon people is it's not speeding up because we're getting better. People are looking at it and going, look at that. We're discovering breaches now in days. That's much better than 8 months. But the reality of it is
because we're getting noisy. Because when you get the ransomware, somebody's asking for money.
That's exactly it. That's exactly it. It's the bad guy tells you, I'm like, that's like any kind of crime. We would be able to say, look, all of our FBI crime stats have gotten better if all the criminals told us the moment they did the crime that they did it, right? Our numbers everywhere would improve. And so that's the reason why we saw this skewing effect of, hey, we're getting, quote, so much better. But really, it was just because they're telling us that they're there now. But if you removed ransomware from that chart, we're back out to 8 to 9 months. And we're also seeing a lot of impacts from, COVID really changing some of the ways in which that cyber landscape looks.
So do you look at on the ransomware attacks, have you looked at the data to see how long were they in the systems before they actually executed the ransomware attack?
Yeah, typically they don't hang around for very long. They're usually pretty quick to pull the trigger. And what we've found is that most often the reason for that seems to be that they want to hit the organization, launch the malware, and then typically move on to the next one. Because while we are seeing more and more organizations pay the ransom, there obviously is a percentage that don't. There's also typically some negotiation that sometimes will happen. So they can demand whatever ransom they want, but ultimately it may get negotiated down to something less. And as crazy as it sounds, the threat actors, this is their job. This is their business. So if they look at it as kind of, hey, only some percentage are going to pay out. And of those, it's going to be a fraction of what I demand. I need to keep going and getting more. So they kind of launch it and then they move on. And typically they're doing it over and over again.
What are you seeing in terms of payments and, percentages of what they're initially asking for that actually get paid out?
Yeah, I would say it tends to depend on the size and scope of the impact, in terms of how many endpoints are they able to get their ransomware onto and whether or not they can get a perspective on the level of impact it has to the victim. So, we would see stuff that would be as small as, tens of thousands of dollars in ransom demand to easily tens of millions of dollars. We've seen a handful that have been in excess of $100 million, but those are much more rare. But I would say typically they come in somewhere in the tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars. And then if the threat actor is specifically targeting a victim, they know they want into a certain victim and they know exactly what they want to hit when they get there, then typically that's where we'll look at things that'll be in the millions or tens of millions, because it's a more targeted attack and they know what the pain is that they're causing that organization versus maybe a lot of the kind of smash and grab or opportunistic ransomware events that typically are much smaller.
You mentioned COVID there, that during the pandemic, I mean, a lot of CISOs had to scramble around, and there was always this question about, because we moved into these remote home environments, are we seeing an increase because of the pandemic in threats?
Yeah, and it's interesting you say that, because when we first saw COVID happening, it was, I mean, I'm glad people asked the question, but it was like the day lockdowns happened, people wanted to know what the cybersecurity impacts were. And we're like, we haven't seen enough data yet. We haven't seen enough time go by to know what the impacts were. But then after that, we've now gathered, 2+ years of data, and we definitely see impacts. I would say the biggest thing is, one, just anecdotally talking to CISOs, basically what they're saying is, look, we did a monumental effort, and, I absolutely applaud the ability for the businesses to get people remote and do it so quickly. But the thing we definitely saw was, I don't know if I want to say shortcuts were taken, because that kind of sounds malicious, and it's not. In this case, everyone was trying to do the right thing for the people, the business, and the employees. But in order to do it that fast, there were things that had to get skipped or overlooked, because the time it takes to do them it doesn't work, right? The bureaucracy involved, especially larger organizations that may have had a lot more moving parts to deal with, kind of took more of the approach of, look, let's just make this happen, and we will go back and try to fix and figure out what didn't get done right and address it. And the challenge we saw with that, as you can probably imagine from a security standpoint, that means there's the potential that whatever got overlooked, whatever got skipped, whatever needed fixing, it was a question of how long did it linger before it got fixed, and how many organizations were even able to really go back and figure out where all those gaps were that they created. A lot of challenges we saw were around things like employees moving home and sending equipment there. How well were organizations tracking the assets that they were now buying and sending all over the place, especially if you were a business that maybe historically didn't have a lot of hybrid or remote workers.
The article this podcast is based upon can be viewed in the best-selling cybersecurity leadership book, CISO Compass, Navigating Cybersecurity Leadership Challenges with Insights from Pioneers. What sort of other things were getting skipped?
The other big things that we saw issues with were around security operations centers and fusion centers. And it wasn't even so much about skipping as I would say the culture changed. So if you think of, traditionally how a SOC or a fusion center would work, the whole concept of their existence is you have all these people that have a reason, a need, a value of working together essentially in one room, right? The big screens all around, and it facilitates great collaboration, because if I see something and I need to talk to Bob or Nancy, they're right over there. I could walk over, we can share, collaborate, go into a huddle room on the side and get whatever we need done. And you've got your incident responders, you've got people monitoring firewalls, IDS, people who need to get data from the DNS or mail filters, all in one spot. And then you go from having that great collaborative centralized environment where all these minds can come together to now everybody is remote. And whether it's the SOC or the fusion center, everybody, I want to say, told themselves to some degree that we can make this work. But obviously the creation of the SOC and the fusion center, from the beginning, the whole point of it was it works better when they're in one room. Now with everyone remote, that creates challenges. And also, I think the other thing that challenged a lot of organizations is it's a lot harder to do some of that collaboration. As much as we have, Zoom or WebEx or BlueJeans or whatever the platform is, it's a completely different thing in terms of the if you wanted to just walk up to someone at their desk, you would think nothing of it if it looked like they were not busy or on the phone. But if you ping someone on Slack and they don't answer right away, you might say, okay, I'll come back to that later. Whereas if you were in the SOC or the Fusion Center, you would have probably addressed it relatively quickly. And so there's gaps like that, misconnections like that. And then also people working maybe more split schedules. Maybe they're not working a traditional 9-to-5 shift with all the people they know. They're working here. They need to take an hour off here to go do something with take the kids to school or pick the kids up from an activity or whatever it might be. That all got a lot more complicated. And again, I applaud everybody for all the effort to make it work. But I think that the reality of it is it isn't working as well as it was when they were all in those, operation centers or fusion centers.
Mm-hmm. So how are people getting into systems today? What's the predominant threat to our organizations that we really should be focusing on?
Yeah. So there's a handful of things that really stand out to me. One, the human element still is just absolutely critical. When we look back on our data, about 82% of the breaches we see involve the human element. So there's no doubt that the people play a huge part of this. And I'm not necessarily saying that 82% are, quote, insiders. That's not the way we look at it. It's that they played a role, whether intentional or accidental, right? So it might have been they played a role by virtue of being phished or pretexted, for example. And so there's a huge portion in which I think the human factor can be improved upon in order to be able to improve our overall cybersecurity. I was at RSA now. It's always an interesting sight to see. And there is just amazing quantities of new technology out there, and everyone's looking for the greatest, latest whiz-bang, shiny object. And many of them serve a very useful purpose. But the challenge I see a lot of organizations trying to do is trying to solve most of their problems with more technology. Because it's hey, if I can spend X dollars and basically buy something to make the problem go away, that's what a lot of people want to do. But, when you look at the kind of the mantra of people, process, and technology is really just one piece of it, right? We need to solve the people part and the process part. And interestingly enough, when we do all these incident responses and investigations, I was just talking with somebody about this the other day, that the majority of the time when we go back and look at the reports, the recommendations are seldomly saying, buy more stuff. It's almost always, there were lots of gaps in these processes. There were lots of areas where these people didn't know what they were supposed to do, or they weren't educated on where to find the policies or how to execute, or mistakes were made. But a lot of times the failures are on the people and the process less of the technology. And when there are gaps in the technology, oddly enough, it's usually the people part. It's we had a feature and we never turned it on, or we didn't train our people on how to use it. So they're kind of only slightly using the technology, or they turned it on and then they let it be, and it's been flagging. I mean, I had one case where it was a SQL injection attack, and this was one where the organization's logs showed every instance of the SQL injection. I mean, it was a forensic investigator's dream because the logs were perfect. And there was something like 800,000 queries that were all beautifully documented in the logs. And you look back on it and you go, wow, this is amazing. This is totally something the organization, could have and should have caught, right? 800,000 events, even if you let 1,000 go by, there's still a lot to see there. And ultimately what we found was their technology was perfect. There was just no people assigned to monitoring it. So those logs just gathered data. And then when we came in and did the breach investigation, we found the data and said, here's the story of how your breach occurred. But it could have been used proactively or preventatively, but it wasn't.
Is that a staffing issue, do you think?
I think it's a combination. I think part of it is a staffing issue. And I think, we look at the cyber talent shortage, and I think that's a problem that's going to be with us for a while. It's, everybody doesn't have enough cyber people to go around, and the Great Resignation, I'm sure, hit a lot of organizations as well, people moving and jumping. So I think definitely the talent market is an impact. And then I also think it's a training thing as well. There's a lot of new technology that has kind of come out onto the horizon that a lot of people have not been kind of upskilled into. The other thing that I've also seen, which is I think contributed to it, is, we look at the cyber talent pool, and, if we say it's this big, and then we say, okay, now we want to look at moving everything to cloud. Well, now we need cyber people that are specific to cloud. So all of a sudden, our potential pool of resources to tap into are smaller because our traditional cyber experts, they may not be versed in cloud. So now we're all moving to a technology or a technology category for which I would argue that we have an even lesser pool of resources to tap into. So I think that's going to definitely be a contributing issue.
Where do you think most of these threats are coming from? And how should we be guarding against that?
So the majority of what we see is coming from external threat actors. It's almost about 80-20 external to internal. And a lot of what we see is opportunistic. And so what I mean by that is it's less about that adversary or threat actor specifically targeting you as the victim or the intended target as much as it is they're really just trolling for low-hanging fruit. We see this, on the Verizon backbone. We see tremendous amounts of data moving every single day. There's an interesting opportunity there that we have to look at that and build a map of threat actor patterns of activity and kind of try to triangulate and stitch together what it is they're doing to kind of build a profile of it. And so that gives us interesting optics into that external threat actor perspective. And most of what we see there is they're looking for unpatched vulnerabilities that they can very easily exploit. And it sounds like a really simple, okay, great, we'll just patch everything. But, one of the things that I always come back to is the importance of, and it's really boring, I know, but the importance of cyber hygiene. Because a lot of times what I find is organizations say, great, we're going to go patch everything. And then I say, okay, what's the everything? If you were to tell me you patched 90%, you patched 90% of what? And you kind of see people looking around going, 90% of what? What is the 90%? Nobody knows. And so there's that issue of, do you have a really good sense of what the asset landscape, asset inventory looks like? Again, it's relatively boring, but it's extraordinarily important because it's going to be that area that you're not looking at, that you're not focusing on. Like they say, it's the weakest link in the chain. If you have assets that are not being patched, that's going to be the area that becomes trivially easy over time for a threat actor to get into. And we see a lot of organizations, for example, that go through a lot of merger and acquisition or divestiture activity that typically sees this as being an even bigger issue because there's the element of we're not really sure what assets we're getting and what responsibility we might have over them, but we're being told it all needs to be integrated, or we believe we've sold off this and now we don't need to manage and monitor these assets, only to find out later on the entity you divested things off to maybe wasn't actually taking that and managing it at all. And so you have a lot of kind of gaps in terms of, responsibility and accountability that can build up over time.
Are there certain countries that we should be more concerned about, and what do we do with that? Do we block IP addresses of these different countries, or is that futile, or how do we approach this?
Yeah, no, and I get that question a lot, and ever since February timeframe when the Russia-Ukraine conflict had started and really kind of kicked off, everyone was asking that: do we just block all of Russia? What I tell people to that question is, one, I think that it's not limited to any one geography per se. And I think even if you could say that the majority of cyber attacks emanated from, Russian origin or Chinese origin or North Korea, or, there's obviously a number of geographic and political entities that obviously are not always friendly towards others, whether it's us or anyone else out there. Everyone's kind of got somebody that's eyeing them. I think the challenge is looking at it from an IP address perspective. To your point, I think is kind of a bit futile just because it is so easy for that to be masked. It is so easy for, even just a moderately skilled threat actor to leverage, a proxy, a VPN, a Tor. They hack a system somewhere else and use it as, a bastion host or something like that. And so I find that in many cases, blocking by IP due to region is very difficult to affect an outcome. What I tell people is, look, if you don't do any business with a region and you can safely kind of shut the lights off over there and say we're comfortable with that, it doesn't present a risk to our legitimate business operations, then sure, go ahead and do it. It never hurts. But a lot of organizations I talk to, they either have a global footprint that makes it hard, or they're, customers or consumers travel the world. And so if they block by IP, they may end up blocking customers that are traveling somewhere on vacation or something like that, or traveling for business. And so that becomes more difficult. And so typically what I tell people is look at the behavior, look at the analytics. My big thing is integrated threat intelligence. I often say that integrated word sometimes is more important than the threat intelligence piece. And what I mean by that is, you can't just have a threat intel platform that gets a feed. It needs to actually be plugged into something and activating something, enriching something. Does that threat intelligence flow into your EDR to automatically look for new indicators when your feed brings that in? Does that feed into, DNS filtering for you of malicious domains? Does it feed into your web or your email gateway proxies so that you can restrict access to things that your threat intelligence tells you is bad? If you're doing those things, you can actually be getting value out of, the threat intelligence in a manner that helps you prevent something before it occurs, as opposed to, a lot of organizations using their tooling more for kind of response after the fact.
Well, I think that's fantastic advice, and I know we could talk all day about the about the threats and the findings in the report. What can we leave our current CISOs, emerging CISOs, experienced CISOs, as they go down this path and try to communicate the threats to their senior management and their environment?
Sure. I'd say a couple things stand out to me. One is, and I focused on this in my talk at RSA as well, and I said, look, you can't get too into the technical weeds. A lot of people who have built their background as a practitioner sometimes can get overly excited about the details, the data, the evidence, the analytics. All of that is great and helps drive decisions. But when you're looking at talking to the C-suite and the board about what you're trying to accomplish or why we need to spend X on something, your audience, the eyes are going to glaze over if you try to talk to them about threat actor details. In a lot of cases, you really need to put it in the language of risk. What is the risk to the business if we don't do this? What is it that we can do to mitigate that risk by doing this? Much like other, stakeholders in the business might talk about, what it is they're doing in terms of financial risk or contract risk or vendor supply chain risk. We need to talk about cyber in the same way. Otherwise, we get too into the weeds, too into the technical minutia. We can sometimes lose our audience.
Well, thanks, Chris. This has been fantastic. I appreciate what you've done for the industry. It's been a pleasure working with you on some boards, and I know you're also working on a national board now as well, aren't you?
Right. Yeah. The CISA's Cyber Safety Review Board. We actually just completed our first investigation. So exciting stuff. Maybe we'll have another chat on that sometime.
Yeah, that sounds great. So thanks for all that you're doing to help the rest of us in that as well.
You bet, Todd. Always a pleasure. Thanks.
Thank you. Wiz is on a mission to help every organization rapidly identify and remove critical risks in their cloud environments. Purpose-built for the cloud, Wiz delivers full-stack visibility, accurate risk prioritization, and enhanced business agility. Wiz connects in minutes using an agentless approach that scans both platform configurations and inside every workload. We perform a deep assessment that goes beyond what standalone CSPM and CWPP tools offer to find the toxic combination of flaws that represent real risk. To learn more about Wiz, please visit securityweekly.com/Wiz.